Apache Warfare: How Native Americans Outsmarted the U.S. Army, 1870s. Since 1709, the Spanish crown has maintained thousands of troops just to contain them, yet they remain unconquered. The historian's words hung in the air as another body was carried into Camp Grant. The Apache had struck again, leaving behind their signature calling card, a perfectly aimed spear and not a single warrior in sight. Their ability to appear and disappear like ghosts had confounded military leaders for generations. What made the Apache such formidable adversaries that even the world's greatest armies struggled to defeat them? The Phantom Warriors, early signs of the Apache threat. In the spring of 1709, Spanish Captain Antonio de Ulibarri wrote in his field journal, "We pursue them for days only to find ourselves the hunted." His expedition of 150 soldiers had been dispatched to subdue Apache raiders near Santa Fe. 6 weeks later, he returned with 37 men, having never engaged in a single direct battle. King Carlos III later calculated that Apache containment consumed more resources per enemy combatant than any other colonial conflict, allocating nearly a third of his colonial military budget to this seemingly endless struggle. The brutally effective Apache tactics became evident in a series of encounters throughout Arizona Territory. In 1867, a cavalry detachment from Fort Bowie tracked a small Apache raiding party that had stolen horses. After 3 days of pursuit, they discovered their own supply wagon had been attacked from behind. The Apache hadn't been fleeing at all. They had circled around while leaving false trails for the soldiers to follow. "They never fight as we expect," wrote Lieutenant James Carleton in his 1868 report. "When we prepare for a large engagement, they dissolve into the landscape. When we relax our guard, 20 warriors materialize from nowhere." Unlike the Comanche or Sioux, who often gathered hundreds of warriors for battlefield confrontations, Apache tactical doctrine evolved specifically to neutralize the firepower advantage of their enemies. Their fighting units typically consisted of small, mobile groups of 8 to 20 warriors who struck quickly and disappeared before an organized response could form. The effectiveness of this approach became tragically clear at Dragoon Springs in 1869. When rancher Michael Sullivan spotted Apache scouts watching his property, he gathered 15 armed neighbors to establish a defensive position. After 2 quiet days, the settlers concluded the threat had passed. That night, Apache warriors silently killed all but 3 of the defenders, without firing a single shot, using only hand weapons, to avoid alerting those sleeping nearby. Water determined survival in the southwestern deserts, and the Apache turned this natural reality into a tactical advantage. When Major John Green led 180 soldiers in pursuit of an Apache band in 1870, his expedition carried 600 gallons of water. Within 4 days, his men were on half rations, while the Apache led them through increasingly arid terrain. Green eventually abandoned the pursuit after losing 8 men to heat exhaustion. Later investigation revealed the Apache fighters had traveled within a quarter-mile of 5 different water sources unknown to military cartographers. This environmental mastery extended beyond water. In 1871, an Army supply train was ambushed near Tucson. The survivors reported the Apache appeared to rise directly from the desert floor. Investigation showed the warriors had partially buried themselves in the sand, remaining motionless for hours until the perfect moment to strike. They had positioned themselves so precisely that not one of the 12 guards spotted them until the attack began. The Apache developed reconnaissance capabilities that military observers frequently documented with disbelief. In the Chiricahua Mountains, they established a relay system of observation posts on high points using smoke signals visible for over 40 miles to communicate troop movements. When Colonel George Crook analyzed Apache intelligence gathering in 1872, he concluded they typically knew the strength, direction, and composition of military forces within hours of their departure from forts. Physical evidence of this surveillance network appeared throughout the territory. Near the Pinal Mountains, Army scouts discovered rock arrangements forming specific patterns. Captured Apache later revealed these served as directional markers and troop strength indicators, allowing warriors to track military movements without direct observation. The system proved so effective that Apache fighters often anticipated patrol routes before the soldiers themselves received their orders. The psychological impact of Apache tactics manifested in settlement patterns across Arizona. Census data from 1870 to 1875 showed that despite fertile land availability, homesteads remained clustered close to military installations. Farmers and ranchers abandoned properties more than 5 miles from forts, at 3 times the rate of those within protective range. The mere perception of Apache presence effectively controlled territory without requiring permanent occupation. This psychological dimension extended to their treatment of casualties. After an attack on a mining camp near Prescott, investigators found the bodies of 4 guards arranged in a specific formation, with particular marks left on their possessions. Apache cultural interpreters explained these served as messages to other potential victims, demonstrating complete control over the engagement and amplifying terror beyond the immediate attack. By 1873, despite deploying over 4,000 troops to Arizona territory, military commanders acknowledged entire regions remained under effective Apache control. This reality directly challenged the prevailing American military doctrine that superior numbers and firepower inevitably secured territorial dominance. The Apache had created a form of battlefield where conventional advantages became liabilities. The tactical innovations of Apache resistance would later find echoes in military developments worldwide. Their techniques of dispersed operations, environmental warfare, and psychological combat presaged modern counterinsurgency challenges by nearly a century. What military leaders of the 1870s labeled as savage warfare would eventually be recognized as a sophisticated approach to asymmetric conflict that neutralized conventional advantages through superior adaptation to environmental and psychological realities. The blood-soaked soil of Arizona territory thus became not just a battlefield, but an unwitting laboratory for warfare's future. The Apache, fighting for survival, pioneered combat approaches that would eventually reshape military thinking worldwide. Their resistance, born of necessity, demonstrated how intimate knowledge of terrain, disciplined small-unit tactics, and psychological warfare could counterbalance overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Blood trails, the Gatchell-Curtis wagon attack, and the missing soldier. The theoretical understanding of Apache tactics materialized into bloody reality during the spring of 1872, when the Gatchell-Curtis mining supply train became their latest target. This attack demonstrated how the Apache applied their combat doctrine in specific operations, revealing both their tactical precision and the devastating consequences for those who encountered them. In early March, a well-financed mining expedition led by Lent and Harpending had passed through Arizona territory en route to Fort Bowie. Their substantial security detail, 20 armed guards with military experience, allowed them to traverse Apache territory without incident. Their safe passage created a false sense of security among smaller outfits following similar routes. The Gatchell-Curtis supply train, returning from the Comstock mines to Tucson with a shipment of silver ore and mining equipment, traveled with just 8 armed men. On March 17th, near the Florence crossing, they encountered Cochise and approximately 15 Chiricahua Apache warriors. The attack that followed became a case study in Apache combat effectiveness. They struck from 3 directions simultaneously, reported Jacob Sims, one of the survivors. No warning, no chance to form a defense. One moment the trail was empty, the next we were surrounded. The Apache had positioned fighters in elevated positions on both sides of a narrow passage, with a blocking force hidden behind rocks on the trail ahead. When the wagons entered this natural ambush zone, the warriors executed a coordinated attack that neutralized half the defenders in the first 30 seconds. Curtis suffered a severe lung wound from an arrow that penetrated between his ribs, while Gatchell received injuries to his arm and shoulder from a lance thrust. 3 guards died in the initial assault. The remaining defenders managed to overturn 2 wagons for cover and return fire, creating enough resistance that the Apache withdrew after taking the mules and supplies. The attack location proved significant to military analysts. This same stretch of trail had witnessed the Miller-Tappan wagon train ambush 18 months earlier. with nearly identical tactics employed. The Apache had identified this terrain as providing optimal ambush conditions and repeatedly utilized it as a killing zone. Despite this pattern being documented in military reports, civilian travelers received no warnings about specific high-risk locations. 4 days after the attack, the survivors staggered into Camp Grant in deplorable condition. The desert journey had stripped them of what little the Apache had left them. Their clothing hung in tatters, torn by mesquite and cactus spines. Severe sunburn and dehydration had left them barely able to walk. Military physicians documented that 2 survivors required skin grafts due to extensive cactus spine injuries. They looked like they'd been dragged through hell, noted the camp surgeon in his medical report. Curtis won't survive the week with that lung wound. It's a miracle they made it here at all. The Gatchell-Curtis ambush bore striking similarities to the Kennedy-Israel attack of 1870, where the Apache had also targeted a mining supply train in a narrow passage. This repetition of tactics against similar targets suggested a deliberate Apache strategy targeting the economic infrastructure supporting white settlement. By disrupting mining operations through attacks on supply lines, they effectively undermined territorial development while acquiring valuable resources. The attack on the Gatchell-Curtis train coincided with another Apache engagement that revealed the fate awaiting isolated soldiers. Lieutenant Carroll and a 6-man patrol had departed Camp Grant 2 days before the survivors arrived. When they failed to return on schedule, concern quickly mounted among the command staff. 3 days later, a Pima scout discovered Carroll's body near Eagle Creek. The lieutenant had been killed by a precise arrow strike to the throat. Evidence at the scene indicated his patrol had been ambushed while watering their horses. The soldiers had apparently scattered during the attack, with 5 eventually making their way back to camp through different routes. One soldier, Private James Mackenzie, remained unaccounted for. The search for Mackenzie illustrated the methodical tracking capabilities the military had developed in response to Apache tactics. Captain Thomas Wilhelm selected 4 experienced scouts, 2 Apache from friendly bands, and 2 white frontiersmen, who had learned tracking from native allies. The search party departed with 10 days' provisions and orders to find the missing soldier, dead or alive. The trackers quickly located the ambush site and began following Mackenzie's trail. Unlike his comrades who had fled toward Camp Grant, Mackenzie had become disoriented and headed deeper into Apache territory. Blood spots indicated he had sustained a head wound, likely affecting his judgment. "The sign tells a clear story," reported Samuel Hayes, the lead tracker. "He's moving erratically, stumbling often. The blood trail suggests a scalp wound, probably from an arrow that grazed him." The trail led to a small seep spring hidden among rocks, where Mackenzie had apparently stopped to drink and tend his wounds. Here the trackers made a chilling discovery. The soldier had used his own blood to write his name on a flat rock, perhaps fearing he wouldn't survive to tell his story. The makeshift memorial read simply, "J. Mackenzie, 5th Cavalry, May 20th, 1872. From the spring, the tracks showed Mackenzie wandering in an increasingly erratic pattern, his footprints indicating exhaustion and likely delirium from his wound and exposure. Approximately 2 miles from the spring, the trackers discovered evidence of Mackenzie's final moments. The distinct paw prints of a mountain lion appeared alongside the soldier's trail. The tracks revealed the big cat had stalked Mackenzie for nearly half a mile before attacking. Signs of a brief struggle marked the site, where the predator had overtaken the weakened soldier. A blood trail leading away from the scene told the rest of the story. The mountain lion had dragged Mackenzie's body to a rocky outcropping nearby. The search party recovered what remained of Mackenzie and returned to Camp Grant 6 days after their departure. The death, while not directly at Apache hands, nevertheless resulted from their attack. Military records classified Mackenzie as a combat fatality, one of 17 soldiers killed in Apache engagements that month across Arizona territory. The dual tragedies of the Gatchell-Curtis attack and Mackenzie's death reinforced the psychological impact of Apache warfare. The threat came not only from direct combat, but from the cascading consequences of being wounded and isolated in hostile territory. This environmental dimension of Apache strategy forcing enemies to confront the desert's dangers. After surviving the initial attack, multiplied their effective combat power beyond their actual numbers. Military analysts noted that the Apache had developed an intuitive understanding of what modern warfare would later term force multipliers. By selecting ambush locations that maximized their tactical advantages while exposing survivors to environmental hazards, they effectively weaponized the landscape itself. This approach allowed relatively small Apache bands to project combat power disproportionate to their numbers across vast territories. The Gatchell-Curtis attack also demonstrated the intelligence-gathering capabilities that supported Apache operations. Their knowledge of the wagon train's route, cargo, and security arrangements suggested a sophisticated reconnaissance network. Civilian settlements, stage stations, and even military outposts likely harbored Apache informants who provided critical intelligence to war leaders like Cochise. These events transformed abstract tactical analysis into visceral reality for Arizona's military commanders and civilian population. The Apache had created a combat environment where conventional military responses proved consistently inadequate, a reality written in blood across the territory's sun-baked trails. Death at the Gates, the Mexican Courier, and the Apache Woman's Gambit. The Apache's ability to strike with impunity, even in the shadow of military installations, received stark demonstration in the summer of 1872. Just 1 week after reinforcements arrived at Camp Grant, a Mexican courier employed by the territorial government approached the fort on horseback. The man carried dispatches from Tucson regarding supply allocations and troop deployments. At 11:30 in the morning, with the courier less than 1,000 yards from the fort's entrance, a soldier on watch duty observed a flash of movement from a cluster of mesquite trees. Before he could sound an alarm, an Apache warrior rose from concealment and hurled a lance with devastating accuracy. The weapon struck the courier in the chest, piercing through his torso. The Mexican's scream alerted the garrison, but by the time soldiers reached him, he had already fallen from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Captain William Randall, the fort's commander, immediately organized a pursuit party. 20 mounted soldiers galloped toward the mesquite thicket, but found only trampled grass and a clear set of moccasin prints leading toward the foothills. The tracks showed the Apache had prepared multiple escape routes, splitting into 3 different directions after the initial sprint from the ambush site. He planned this perfectly, noted Sergeant Daniel Foster, the fort's most experienced tracker. Waited until his target was close enough to ensure a kill, but far enough from our rifles to guarantee his escape. He probably watched our patrol patterns for days. The pursuit continued for 3 hours before Randall called it off. The Apache had disappeared into rocky terrain, where horses couldn't follow, and continuing on foot would only expose his men to potential ambush. The soldiers returned to Camp Grant, with nothing to show for their efforts except the courier's body and his blood-stained dispatches. The incident revealed a critical vulnerability in military operations. Despite having over 200 soldiers stationed at Camp Grant, the Army couldn't secure even the immediate approaches to the fort. The Apache had demonstrated they could strike at will, virtually within rifle range of a major installation, then vanish without consequence. Military correspondence from this period reveals the psychological impact of such killings. In a letter to his superiors in San Francisco, Captain Randall wrote, "The men feel we are under constant observation. The Apache could have killed any one of us over the past week. They chose the courier deliberately, perhaps to demonstrate that our communications remain vulnerable." The courier's death illustrated a pattern documented by Lieutenant George Bork in his analysis of Apache attacks. They preferentially targeted individuals carrying information. Bork's data showed that between 1868 and 1872, couriers and scouts were killed at 3 times the rate of other travelers, suggesting the Apache understood the strategic value of disrupting enemy communications and intelligence gathering. The courier was buried in the small cemetery outside Camp Grant, joining 16 other victims of Apache attacks interred there since the fort's establishment. The military funeral was brief, the chaplain's words nearly lost in the constant wind that swept across the desert. By sunset, The incident had been recorded in the fort's logbook, another statistic in the ongoing conflict. 3 days after the courier's death, a young Apache woman appeared at the fort's gate shortly after dawn. She carried an infant strapped to her back and approached, with her hands raised to show she posed no threat. Through an interpreter, she identified herself as Nashota, a member of the Aravaipa band. She claimed to be fleeing mistreatment by her own people following her husband's death in a skirmish with cavalry troops. According to her account, her husband's relatives blamed her for his death, believing she had brought bad luck to him. Without male protection, she and her child faced increasing abuse. "They give me no food, no shelter," she told the interpreter. "My husband's brother says I should follow him to the afterlife." Such internal conflicts within Apache social structures were well documented. Anthropologist Grenville Goodwin had noted that widows without family support often faced severe hardship, especially if their husbands died in combat. The woman's story aligned with known Apache cultural patterns, lending credibility to her account. What made her appearance extraordinary was her offer. In exchange for protection for herself and her child, she would guide soldiers to a rancheria village, where several warriors responsible for recent attacks, including possibly the courier's killer, were currently camped. "I know where they sleep," she said. "I can take you there before they move again." Captain Randall recognized both the opportunity and the risk. Apache informants had occasionally provided valuable intelligence, but there was always the possibility of deception or a trap. After consultation with his officers, Randall decided to organize a force of 30 infantry soldiers. Mobility would be sacrificed for stealth, as mounted troops would be too easily detected in the rocky terrain where Apache typically established their temporary camps. The expedition departed at dusk, with each soldier carrying 3 days' rations, 60 rounds of ammunition, and minimal equipment. Nashota led them east from the fort, moving with surprising speed despite carrying her child. She demonstrated intimate knowledge of the landscape, identifying hidden water sources and game trails invisible to untrained eyes. Throughout the night march, she insisted on absolute silence, communicating through hand signals and occasionally whispering to the interpreter. By dawn, she had led the soldiers into a labyrinth of small canyons and rock formations where, she indicated, they should rest during daylight hours to avoid detection. "Apache have eyes everywhere," she warned. "They watch the high places during day. We move only at night." The soldiers concealed themselves among the rocks, posting sentries at vantage points. The woman's behavior during this rest period drew mixed reactions. Some soldiers noted she seemed genuinely frightened, constantly scanning the horizon. Others reported she appeared to be studying the soldiers' equipment and weapons with unusual interest. As dusk approached, Nashota indicated they would reach the rancheria before midnight. The final approach required navigating a narrow canyon that opened into a small valley where, according to her, 15 to 20 Apache had established a temporary camp. Lieutenant James Parker, second in command of the expedition, documented what happened next in his official report. Upon reaching the valley overlook at approximately 11:15 p.m., we observed the expected clearing, but found no signs of habitation, no fires, no structures, no movement. The woman appeared confused, claiming the camp had been there 2 days prior. As the soldiers surveyed the empty valley, a warning shot echoed from the rocks above. Within seconds, arrows and rifle fire rained down from elevated positions surrounding them. 2 soldiers fell wounded immediately. The expedition had walked into a classic Apache ambush, caught in low ground with enemies controlling the heights. Captain Randall ordered an immediate withdrawal. The darkness and unfamiliar terrain made retreat difficult, but a peculiar environmental phenomenon aided their escape. An unusually thick fog had begun forming in the canyon, providing cover as the soldiers carried their wounded back the way they had come. The Apache fired blindly into the mist, but inflicted no additional casualties. Suspicion immediately fell on Nashota. Several soldiers demanded summary execution, convinced she had deliberately led them into a trap. Sergeant Foster argued for her immediate hanging, while others suggested she be used as a hostage in future negotiations. Captain Randall, however, noted inconsistencies that complicated the situation. If the woman had intended a trap, Why choose such difficult terrain that ultimately aided the soldiers' escape? Why did the Apache spring their ambush before the entire expedition had entered the valley? And most puzzlingly, why did the Apache use firearms for their initial shots, alerting the soldiers, rather than silently picking them off with arrows, as was their usual tactic? When questioned, Nashota maintained her innocence. "They must have seen us coming," she insisted. "Apache always watch their old camps. They know you follow me." Unable to determine her true intentions amid the conflicting evidence, Randall ordered her bound but unharmed for the return journey. The expedition began the long march back to Camp Grant. The soldiers exhausted and demoralized, the two wounded men carried on improvised stretchers. During their second night on the return journey, Nashota executed a daring escape. The sentry reported she had asked to relieve herself, and when he checked on her minutes later, found only her outer clothing and the cut ropes that had bound her. Despite her bare feet and lack of provisions, she had vanished into the darkness. The expedition returned to Camp Grant 3 days after their departure, having accomplished nothing except acquiring 2 wounded men and a deepened sense of frustration. Military intelligence officers debated the woman's true motives for weeks afterward. Had she genuinely sought refuge and been as surprised by the empty camp as the soldiers, or had she executed an elaborate deception, purposely leading troops into danger? The question appeared answered when, remarkably, Nashota reappeared at Camp Grant 2 weeks later. She approached the fort alone, still carrying her infant, and surrendered herself to the guards. When questioned, she offered a simple explanation. "My child is here. I could not leave him." Investigation revealed she had indeed left her infant at the fort before their departure, entrusting it to the care of the interpreter's wife. This fact had not been communicated to Captain Randall or his officers. Anthropologist Edward Curtis, who documented this incident in his studies of Apache culture, suggested her actions reflected the complex position of women in Apache society during the conflict period. Women sometimes served as intermediaries between warring factions, occasionally providing information to both sides as a survival strategy. Their primary loyalty remained to their children and immediate family, rather than to broader tribal or military objectives. The military authorities, unable to prove malicious intent, and perhaps recognizing the propaganda value of showing mercy, eventually released Nashota to the care of peaceful Apache living near the fort. She and her child disappeared from historical records afterward, their ultimate fate unknown. Military strategists later identified this incident as exemplifying the challenges of human intelligence gathering in counterinsurgency operations. The Nashota case became a teaching example at West Point in the early 20th century, highlighting how cultural misunderstandings and the fog of war could undermine even well-planned military operations. Patterns of Apache presence across the territory. Throughout the Arizona Territory, evidence of Apache activity manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Military patrols from Camp Grant encountered these signs with increasing frequency during 1872 to 1873, building a composite picture of Apache territorial control that extended far beyond direct combat engagements. Among the more unusual acquisitions at Camp Grant was a second herd of horses confiscated from Apache raiders. Captain Freeman noted in his field journal, "These are not like our cavalry mounts, smaller but remarkably hardy. We rode them hard for 3 days without water, yet they showed none of the distress our army horses would display." The Apache had selectively bred these animals over generations, creating horses perfectly adapted to desert warfare. When Army veterinarians examined them, they discovered physiological differences, denser blood vessels in their legs, and enhanced kidney function that allowed these horses to conserve water while maintaining stamina across rocky terrain. In July 1872, soldiers at Camp Grant observed something peculiar. Near the fort's perimeter, carefully arranged battlefields, where red and black ants fought in unnatural formations. Dr. Thomas Norton, a field biologist with the Smithsonian Institution, recognized these as deliberate Apache communications. The Apache used these ant battles as a form of psychological messaging. Norton wrote to his colleagues, "Red ants represent their warriors. Black ants symbolize soldiers. I've documented 17 such arrangements, each appearing 24 to 48 hours before Apache activity in the area. Initially dismissed as superstition, military intelligence officers began recording these incidents after noticing the pattern. Lieutenant Wilson's patrol logbook from August 18th noted, "Ant formation observed Tuesday. Raid on Henderson's ranch occurred Thursday. Same sequence as previous 3 incidents." In September, Wilson's patrol discovered extensive cornfields hidden in a narrow canyon 15 miles from the fort. The fields showed sophisticated irrigation, small channels diverted from a spring, stone dams creating catchments, and carefully terraced growing areas that maximized limited water. The agricultural engineering demonstrated knowledge that contradicted prevailing views of Apache as purely nomadic hunters. "They've been growing crops here for years," Wilson reported. "The irrigation system alone would take months to construct." Following orders to target Apache food sources, Wilson's men destroyed the fields. During this operation, they captured 2 women who had been tending the crops. Through interpreters, the women revealed crucial information about seasonal migration patterns. "We move with the food," one woman explained. "Summer in the mountains for corn and berries, winter in the lower valleys for game. We have food caches, 20-30 places, hidden where soldiers cannot find." This distributed supply system proved remarkably resilient against military interdiction efforts. When Army units destroyed one cache, others remained viable. The women's interrogation records revealed the Apache maintained at least 40 hidden food storage locations across their territory, many disguised as natural rock formations or buried under specific landmark trees. The most significant engagement occurred in October, when Captain Harold Freeman's patrol discovered an abandoned Apache village in the Dragoon Mountains. The site contained medicine lodges, with ceremonial objects still in place, painted gourds, feathered staffs, and clay bowls containing herbal mixtures. Private Thomas Mercer, who survived the subsequent ambush, described what happened. "We found strange symbols painted on rocks, circles with lightning bolts, handprints in red ochre. Captain Freeman was examining some kind of altar when the first shots came. They'd been watching us the whole time, waiting until we were completely exposed." The Apache had allowed the soldiers to enter the village before closing a carefully prepared trap. The firefight lasted 53 minutes by Mercer's watch. Cavalry Private John Hendricks died instantly from a rifle shot to the chest. 3 others suffered serious wounds before Freeman's men established a defensive position on higher ground. During their withdrawal, the patrol observed smoke signals appearing on mountaintops across the region, 3 short puffs followed by 1 long column. Within minutes, similar signals appeared on peaks up to 30 miles distant. It was like watching a telegraph system. Freeman wrote in his report, "One mountain would signal, then another would respond. They could transmit information across the entire territory faster than our own courier system." Military attempts to disrupt this communication network largely failed. When soldiers established observation posts on key peaks, the Apache simply shifted to alternative signaling methods, reflective surfaces during daylight, fire patterns at night, or physical trail markers invisible to untrained eyes. Environmental impacts of the conflict appeared in unexpected locations. In November, Lieutenant Parker's scouting party found a stream near the Pinal Mountains contaminated with human remains. Archaeological evidence indicated the site had served as an Apache burial ground for generations. "The water runs milky with calcium from bones," Parker reported. "Local guides indicate this was sacred ground, where Apache brought their dead. Recent military pressure has disrupted their burial practices." The human cost of the Apache wars marked the landscape itself. Along the road to Tucson, travelers passed dozens of stone cairns marking where settlers had fallen. Mexican victims received different markers, crosses fashioned from mezcal stalks or Spanish bayonets. These memorials created a geographical record of the conflict's intensity, clusters of cairns marking ambush zones, isolated monuments telling stories of lone travelers caught in the wrong place. The most discussed of these markers commemorated Thomas and William Brewer, freight haulers attacked near Cienega Creek in early 1872. When their wagon failed to arrive in Tucson, a search party found a scene that entered territorial legend. They formed a fort from their own wagon, reported James McKinley, who discovered the site. Empty cartridge cases everywhere. William had 27 arrows in him, but kept fighting. Thomas used his last bullet on himself rather than be taken. The Brewer brothers' last stand became emblematic of civilian life in Apache territory. Their story appeared in newspapers as far east as Chicago, simultaneously celebrating white resistance, while reinforcing the perceived savagery of Apache warfare. What these accounts rarely mentioned was the strategic context. The Brewers had been transporting mining equipment through a canyon that Apache leaders had specifically warned should remain undisturbed, an area containing ancestral burial sites. Their deaths, while tragic, occurred within a complex territorial conflict that newspapers reduced to simple narratives of savagery versus civilization. By late 1873, the cumulative impact of these encounters had transformed Arizona territory into a landscape defined by conflict. Every rock formation might conceal Apache observers. Every unusual arrangement of stones or plants might carry meaning invisible to outsiders. The physical environment itself had become both weapon and witness to a struggle that would ultimately reshape the American Southwest. The Apache conflict transformed Arizona's landscape into a text that could be read by those who understood its language. Through adaptive tactics, environmental mastery, and psychological operations, Apache fighters maintained effective resistance, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their success came not from superior weapons, but from superior understanding of how to leverage landscape, communication, and cultural knowledge as combat multipliers in a war where conventional military doctrine repeatedly failed.